Hello. Thank you again for having me to give this talk virtually. I have a few more questions to answer that we didn't get to in the live broadcast, and I'll start right now. The first question I think is an exciting and fascinating one, and I'll read it now. I remember a time when we were all afraid to hand our fingerprints over to Apple, and I guess that's because we believed our fingerprints were more important to protect than our faces. Which reminds me how hard it is to anticipate the next threat to our privacy, or at least the various avenues we can use to create and recreate our identities. Are fingerprints still a thing even? And this is this is exciting to me to think about too, because in my talk, when I talked a lot about faces, what we're really talking about in general are biometric forms of identification and tracking and control and all of the variables that go into that. On the one hand, these things are very useful and helpful for a variety of health reasons and personal reasons. We can have our Zoom meetings because of these facial recognition technologies, make the cameras work a little better. And the Fitbits and the Apple Watches and their ability to record health data and all these sorts of things are incredibly useful and helpful for a whole host of things. But at the same time, they're ways of measuring and quantifying our bodies and the traces our bodies leave behind in public places. And that entails certain kinds of risks. So fingerprints, of course, the short answer is that fingerprints are still a thing. And it is a challenge to anticipate what might come next in the kinds of things that we would be involved in, wanting to imagine tactical evasions and subversions of. So that's an incredibly important and fascinating question. The next question is, to what extent does this interest in hacking overlap with a history of pranking in spite of its unserious connotations? Pranking is often driven by substantive motivations in social criticism. And this is an incredibly important question too. I hinted at in the talk, I was trying not to get too far into, let's say, some historical relationships, but I hinted at the practice that was called tactical media for a long time has a long and interesting history that is connected to this kind of pranking that is referenced in this question. And this kind of stuff goes back even to people who called themselves the phone freaks in the 60s and 70s, who would use cheap toys that came in a cereal box, a little whistle that came in Captain Crunch. You could blow that whistle at exactly the right pitch to get free phone calls on payphones and those kinds of activities. I think their relationship between seriousness and unseriousness and between social criticism is very interesting to me because they perform these interactions with the technical systems that one who wants to criticize the current sociopolitical conditions that they're living in, they perform these interactions, subversive sort of interactions with the technical systems in which what we would call the sociopolitical circumstances of the sociopolitical world is immersed. It's technical substrate. So we have social criticisms now that might be different from the social criticism in the 1960s and 1970s, because largely because we have a different technical substrate, a technical kind of network of devices that we were talking about I was talking about in the talk itself, that enact what our socius is. We're talking over Zoom now as a response to a pandemic, and had this pandemic occurred in the 1960s, we would have had telephony situations, and we would have to think about what kinds of work from home environments involve regular telephone calls, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the relationship between seriousness and unseriousness and social criticism for me is always an interesting question about a relationship to the technical systems, right? So the phone freaks and the prankers of the 60s and 70s and 80s and tactical media practitioners of the 80s, 90s, and early aughts who've mutated into the kind of artists I was talking about today, who don't necessarily call themselves tactical media artists for, I think, a variety of different reasons in each case. It's always performing their criticism through a kind of active engagement and relationship with the devices, with the technical systems in which the social is immersed or out of which the social emerges. So I think that's another exciting and interesting question. Here's another one that I think is quite thought-provoking too. This one says, in a sense, these tactical interventions are designed to protect some underlying identity against the technologies that recognize, distribute, and mobilize them. Yet we also know that our so-called, quote, real identities are themselves products of and always already operative in sets of power relations. All of these power relations that surround us, networks of power that gender, racialize, and sexualize us. So it seems to me, and you get at this several places in your presentation, that what these tactical interventions do, in addition to resisting extant mobilizations of identities, is that they also help create new power relations that can alter the very framework of how we think identity, or I would add, this is me adding to the question, how we enact identity. Do you see the ways in which these creative interventions destabilize and remake or retrope our more fundamental notions of identity? And I think this is something I agree with, in many and all ways, is that we have two kind of different things going on when you're at a protest in Hong Kong and you're trying to game or trick or trope your face equals your identity relationship so that you can participate in that event without getting captured, like literally captured, right? And tricking that system, hiding your face in such a way that it's hard for it to be seen simply by wearing a baseball cap, which is one of the questions that came up and we talked about, or your hair down in your face, or just happily, by luck and circumstance, turning your face away when the drone goes by, etc. All of those things don't necessarily destabilize or upend some of the questions that are raised in this question about what is the identity relationship. But in the book chapter that this talk was drawn out of, and I mentioned this in the answer to one of the questions in the live broadcast, that was the question about private and public relationships, and I said, all faces are public in a meaningful sense, and that's because our identities are publicly constituted and enacted, and the private part of our identity that we want to protect and preserve is enacted through this. We have language that existed before we were thrown into a world in which we learned to communicate with the words that were in the language we ended up growing up, the languages that we ended up growing up with, several, lots and lots of people grow up with multiple languages, lots of people grow up with one, lots of people grow up with multiple verbal languages and sign systems, and all kinds of different forms of communication. But the relationship between the face as identity and what it means for the authorities is one that is enacted in this case, right, through these technical systems in a way that it can be destabilized and reformatted and rethought. And several of the artists that I think about and research in the book chapter that this talk drew from are doing that kind of work especially. But I think we can see it in really in what we talked about in the talk. The hair and makeup schemes then, if you push it, they're helping you remember that what a lot of people learned in college and grad school and elsewhere, that identity itself is performed and enacted. But I always want to come back to, like I did in the last question, it's enacted in relationship to technical substrates. In this case, it's enacted to camera apparatuses. The value of a face for the authorities, for the police, is different after there is camera technology, and that's in the 19th century when it starts to emerge. But by the 20th century, early 20th century, we start to have a lot of these police technology theories that try to relate identity to, so this kind of phrenology sort of thing that's associating faces, the visible trace of criminality is immediately starting to associate faces with interior identity characteristics, personhood, right? Personality and likely future behaviors that is a little different from, this is the picture of the person on the driver's license, and therefore this is the same person standing in front of you. But the technology that allows the authorities to make that association opens the door for them to make all these other sorts of claims that are related to phrenology. And unfortunately, that connection, that relationship hasn't been rooted out at all, and is still, its vestiges are still there. Talk more about facial recognition technologies being useful in good ways in finding missing people or catching criminals, and of course, and a lot of these facial recognition, but also reconstruction sorts of technologies, where I think we see them on television a lot. A missing person has been missing for a number of years, and they use these kind of sort of algorithmic, but I think they're algorithmic, but these guesswork kind of things that try to imagine what this person would look like today. And those are helpful often, right? And we shouldn't, I'm not saying that these systems are necessarily bad. It's that when they're good, they also entail lots of issues that we should think about. Like they entail, like the last question you mentioned, certain kinds of identity relationships. They entail a legacy of more than 100 years of photographic technologies trying to make us think that the face is a measurable, quantifiable thing that can tell us about interior, natural identity that is somehow real and true and fixed and solid and immutable and all those sorts of things, tendencies. And that's a relationship that we can push on a little bit, while also understanding that there are many useful things that come with these technologies. And the catching criminals thing, I'm a little squeamish about that, in that the part of my talk that covers protest events makes me uncomfortable pinning down too much on the word criminal, because obviously in many of these cases being at the protest event itself has been criminalized in a meaningful way, and in a way that's dangerous for the participants. But from many perspectives, participating in those things is quite necessary and quite a good deal of part of the participatory democracy. And so I want to defer on the catching criminals part of that question. And then couple last questions. One about federal and regulations surrounding the use of facial recognition technologies. There are multiple different regulations, and some of them are at state level and federal level, and they voted in certain cities. I think it was Oakland, California, recently voted to ban facial recognition technology for police use. So the regulatory framework is complicated and hodgepodge is the answer to that one. And then one about change. I think we talked a little bit about this in the live Q&A about, had somebody gotten extensive plastic surgery, if that would change things in a way that like this makeup scheme would. And of course, yes. And so this question was about, does gaining weight change facial recognition technologies? And so it would be, I think, important for me to point out here a couple of different kinds of things that are going on. Some of these technologies are simply algorithms that can detect that there's a face, period. And then after that, there are kind of comparative ones, like I showed a screen grab of some of that research, comparative ones that are better at, once a face has been detected, comparing it to another face, and that's the one that uses, like, for boarding passes and the train tickets, that this face and this face are the same face. And so, like, significant weight gains and weight losses would, of course, change that in the same way that, comparing this face and this face in front of a human viewer, a human interlocutor, right? A human person at the boarding gate. You're holding up your driver's license, and the photo was taken 5 years ago, and you've gained or lost a significant amount of weight, or in my case, I've gotten a lot grayer, and all these sorts of changes. And then the person or algorithm making the comparison is attempting to compare things that have changed a little bit. But in this kind of, because this is, I talked a lot about it being machine learning, they're attempting, the people who research and enact these kinds of systems are attempting to condition machine learning, facial recognition, et cetera, algorithms to be able to make those kinds of judgments, I don't want to call them judgments, but to make those kinds of associations as close as possible to the way we can do it. The attempt, of course, this is all part of a broader set of efforts called artificial intelligence, in that real global sense of it, that people are attempting to create intelligent systems that can make the same kinds of decisions and judgments in that the colloquial sense of decision and judgment, and not in the strict sense that we might object to their ability to make judgments, but to actually be able to recognize changes and say, because of this, and this, these two faces are probably the same individual. So I think that's the questions. Again, I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to do this. I hope everybody enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun for me to have this conversation, even over Zoom, and I wish you all a good day.